Thank you. Very happy to be here and talk with you all this morning. If you're in New York and like I am, and wherever else you are, I will share my screen now. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about the kind of economic approach to projection models. And as Mario mentioned, a lot of my work in this area has been with Professor Richard Scheffler at the University of California, Berkeley, in the School of Public Health. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is work that he's done for a number of years and I've gotten into in the last few years, and kind of how we think about projecting human resources for health. And like Mario said, a lot of these things you have to start planning for now, because the build-up time and all these things you need to produce the health, to do the education and all the things you need for the health workforce, these take time. So you got to start looking at this stuff now. And so the outline of the talk, I'm going to define three main terms we need for this analysis: need, demand, and supply at the outset. I'm going to talk conceptually about kind of what's the background conceptual framework behind the regression equations that we're going to estimate going through. It's a labor market framework. So if you have background in labor market economics, this will be very familiar to you. And we'll go through the regression equations. Ultimately, I'll show you some results of what those regression equations ultimately output at the end. The example I'm going to show you is work that with Professor Scheffler and other colleagues that looked at estimating the need, demand, and supply of health workers globally. So the unit of analysis is going to be the country level, and there's 100 to 200 countries in the analysis. So it's a country level model, but everything I say here can be applied down to a more like within country level. So I'm going to try to show you eventually at the end how you would adapt this to, if you're looking within a country and you want to look at different regions, how you'd adapt this kind of approach. It's very easily adaptable to like a more granular level of analysis. So to start, our three terms. Need, so this is the number of health workers required to attain objectives of a health system. So the definition of need varies, and it will depend. This is something that the individual country will need to decide on. These are the priorities we have. We are going to define need this way. I'll show you a definition of need that we used in one of our papers that WHO came up with. There's no reason that same definition needs to be applied. I think depending on the context and the priorities of certain countries, that definition of need can be changed, and depending on what that definition is, the same type of analysis could then be rerun with that definition. Demand, so demand for health workers really comes from the income of the country. We've seen this globally, or just the amount of funding and finance that the government is willing to put towards healthcare. So demand is really an income kind of issue, and you'll see countries that have more income or just are willing to put more towards health have greater demand. And it differs from need. So there's a lot of countries that have high need. You can think of low income countries, but their demand isn't so high because they just don't have the finances to be able to fund these positions. And so there's a big difference when you look at need versus demand based kind of shortages and surpluses of health workers. And the third is supply. So when you're taking coming up with an estimate of what's the shortage going to be in the future, or what's the surplus going to be in the future. There's two types of shortages or surpluses we'll talk about. The first is a needs-based shortage, so that would just be need minus supply, and the other is a demand-based shortage, and that would be demand minus supply. So supply comes into the picture in both settings, and so the supply is just the number of health workers available in the country. And so a graphical depiction of what we're talking about here. This is the labor market for doctors. And so you have on the horizontal axis the number of doctors. You have on the vertical axis their wage. And so you see demand is a downward sloping line. As the wage decreases, the quantity demanded of the number of doctors will increase. And supply goes the other direction. It's upward sloping. And as the wage increases, the quantity supplied of doctors will increase. So that's the standard kind of supply and demand economic framework. You get the intersection of those two curves is that point E. And if everything is just allowed to work itself out in the market, you'd expect the equilibrium wage to be at W star there, and the equilibrium number of doctors that comes out as N star there. A lot of times countries have resource constraints where they set a cap on the wage that doctors can make. They're either government civil servants that have a cap on their wage, and they set that cap lower than what the equilibrium wage would be. So you can see that as WL there. And when that happens, then you get this demand-based shortage, which would be the distance from A to B. And if looking at that same level, WL, the needs-based shortage would be the distance from the need line, which doesn't vary with the wage. You can see it's just a vertical line. At point C, the distance would be A to C, and that would be your needs-based shortage. And where need comes in here, I've assumed the needs-based shortage is larger than the demand-based shortage. And that's typically what you would see in lower income countries, that the needs-based shortage is bigger than the demands-based shortage. In higher income countries, you see the opposite. So there's no need. In this example, you see AC is greater than AB, but that need line could move inside and likely does move to the left in a higher income country. So again, explaining need, often it's based on the minimum number of health workers needed to address whatever priority population health issues have been decided on to address. A recent WHO report defined need as the number of health workers needed to achieve the median level of attainment for a composite index of 12 tracer health indicators. And so after defining need that way, the report found that you need 4.45 doctors, nurses, and midwives per 1,000 population. So again, there's things you can do with this definition of need. If you think you want to go for a higher level of attainment, you could move that from the 25% there to maybe 35%. That would change the number you need. You could look at different health indicators, and that would change your definition of need. So the need definition really needs to be decided on at the outset, and how that's defined will have a big role in the number of doctors ultimately at the end that you require, the 4.45. So to briefly go through what WHO did and the group of authors that worked on that paper, they looked at these 12 conditions, and they based need off of doing well on these 12 conditions. So each country received 1 point for each indicator where the percent of their population covered was over 80%. So you could see cataract is on the list on the left. If 80% of the population had coverage for cataract surgery, they'd get a 1 on that measure. If you see tobacco smoking at the bottom, if 80% of the country did not smoke, then you get a 1 on that measure. So you could get a score from 0 to 12. And then that score, each category was weighted by the global burden of disease. So smoking has 12 times the burden that the DTP3 immunization does. So scoring a 1 in that category counts 12 times as much as the DTP3 category. And then eventually scores were normalized to be between 0 and 1. Those scores from 0 to 12 normalized to be between 0 and 1. And the median country in the data set had a score of 0.25. And so the group of authors and people at WHO and decided that to come up with their measure of what they thought was needed, they were going to go for an attainment of the median. So drive everyone to the median, and that would take 4.45 health workers. So that score that I just mentioned, that becomes a dependent variable in the need regression. That's on the left side there. The key independent variable is the natural log of the health workers per 1,000 population. You estimate that regression equation, and you get that line, the curved line in the figure below. And then there's a 95% confidence interval there. If you choose the target of 0.25, you start there on the vertical axis, see where that intersects with the dark blue line, go down to the number of health workers per 1,000 population, and that implies you need 4.45 health workers. So that's an example of how we've thought about this in the past of using regression and a need-based model in the labor market framework to come up with some number of how many health workers you will need. Quickly going through demand. Demand's based on, as I said, the national income ends up being a major predictor of this. And previous work has shown that. And so the demand-based version, so we have the need regression equation. This is an example of what a demand-based equation would look like. And so again, the subscripts here, I is for country and T is for year. If you did this on a lower level, I could be for region, doesn't have, instead of country, and the same type of analysis would follow through. We did some work that showed these 5 variables have good predictive power on what demand will be. So you get the income per capita and some lagged measures of income per capita. Sometimes as the income goes up, it takes some time for the income to, the increases in the income or the increases of the budget of the country to work its way through things. The budgets are decided a few years in advance, so it takes a little while for these things to start coming into an effect. So that's why you see some lagged terms there. We also found that out-of-pocket spending per capita has an impact on demand. The more generous this is, so if your constituents aren't paying much out of pocket, the higher demand we saw. And then the percent of the population that's over 65. So as that increases, we've seen that demand really increases as well. So that's kind of a simple baseline model for thinking about demand. You could add extra terms to this, but this gives you kind of an idea of where how we think about demand models. For supply, supply is usually a function of the training capacity in the country. So your education system for educating health workers, And it's also the migration in and out of the country of health workers, and deaths and retirements as well can be taken into account. So we've in the past there's more complicated ways to do this, but this is kind of a basic way. It's just really trending, using a year trend and just looking at the trend in physicians per 1,000 populations and nurse and midwives per 1,000 population, and just projecting that the trend will continue forward. So if you had some things that you thought, well, the way our education system for training healthcare workers has really changed in the last few years, and the past isn't as good of a predictor as the future as it previously might have been, then you'd have to make some adjustments to this. And there's more complicated models. You can use some ARIMA time series models and things of that nature that put more weight on the most recent past than the further away past, if you're worried about, if you want your model to project supply based on the most recent past, more than the very far past. So this is kind of basic, but there's things that can be added to this. So we have our three regression equations there: need, demand, and supply. And so those all produce, you get output from those. And again, it's need minus supply will give you your needs-based shortage, and demand minus supply will give you your demand-based shortage. And so one thing I pointed to a little bit is that a lot of times the needs-based shortage in low-income countries are much higher than the demand-based shortage, because demand, again, is based on income and just like the finances that the country or region or whatever you're talking about have at their disposal. So you see that in the red circles at the top. For the low-income countries, the need-based shortage projection for 2030 is about 6 million versus the demand-based shortage is just 16,000. And yeah, so that's what I wanted to point out there. So a few limitations of this approach. It doesn't include increased productivity. So there's assumptions in here that the amount of services that healthcare workers are going to be able to do themselves kind of looks like it did in the past. So if you thought that really health workers, their productivity has increased quite a bit due to additional technology, you'd want to add that to the model, and there's ways to do that. If you think that this skill mix of the healthcare workers, like, well, previously we've had a lot more physicians, and now we're using some extra nurses and more auxiliary healthcare professionals, and that has really helped our productivity in the last few years, you'd want to add that to the model. So you could do that. I haven't shown that here, but that's definitely something that's possible. And then data availability at the end. A lot of data is based on physicians, data on other healthcare workers that you need as inputs to the model isn't as available sometimes. So that's a limitation. So I want to end by talking about how to adapt this approach. So like I said, all the examples I've shown have been at the country level of the analysis, but you can easily replace country with regions and redo the same analysis. What is sometimes the limitation there, or the most common hurdle when you do this, is when you go down to more granular levels, the data availability might not be as specific as the number of physicians or nurses or midwives or other healthcare professionals at a region by region level. That might not be as complete. Usually that data is more complete at the country level. So that's something you'll have to figure out and kind of work with. And the other thing that will definitely change. I would believe when you go to a within country analysis, is needs going to need to be defined and agreed upon. And so the WHO report was one example, but depending on the politics and things in the specific country or the specific region you're looking at, that there will be ways to redefine need that will address the specific issues that you're interested in your area. So that's my time, I believe, is up there. So I'll end there, and thank you all for